Okay. You're watching LaRouchePAC's Saturday night class for October 21st. My name's Tony Papert. The speaker tonight is Mike Steger, and his subject is Plato's Republic, the cornerstone of Western civilization. Just to say a few words before he comes on, I've been reviewing Plato in preparation for tonight. I read the Gorgias dialogue and remembered many other things of Plato I've read over the years. I tell you, this is much too strong for classrooms, especially today's classrooms. I mean, Plato was engaged in a vibrant, impassioned struggle to avert the collapse of Greek civilization, which was going on as he was writing. And it's read from the standpoint of today's struggle. It's extremely illuminating. It casts a searchlight over our struggle today. I mean, conditions were completely different, but Greece was falling into another dark age, as our Western civilization has been since perhaps 1900, and more rapidly as we come to the 21st century and our own time. Now, today, I mean, we have a great moral divergence in the American population. I mean, we have a part of it which is plodding its way to more extreme features of dark age decadence. And we have a part of it which is waking up morally. So there's a two-way, very dramatic motion visible in American society. But Plato, was the grandfather of our struggle today. And he lost for his own life. Basically, he was not victorious. I mean, there were counter movements. There was even a subsequent age of Greek progress and something of a renaissance called the Hellenistic age. But Greek society still was receding despite all of Plato's efforts, but they were revived by Christianity. Christianity developed as a culture out of the Hellenistic Greek culture of the Middle East, including the Hellenized Jews who wrote the books of the New Testament. And so Plato's struggle created the basis for everything we've achieved since. It's in the heat and sweat and blood of this struggle that Plato was writing. As I said, I just reread the Gorgias dialogue. To near the end, he's exhorting, he's trying to remoralize a man named Callicles, a completely, really defeated product of the downfall of Greek civilization. But Plato is not deterred. Toward the end of that dialogue, he says to him, among many other things, he says to Callicles, I exhort you also to take part in the great combat, which is the combat of life. And that's what we're in today. So with that, I'd like to bring on Mike.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, everyone, for attending tonight. So as Tony said, this is not classroom stuff. It's not academic. And the very point of this, Plato himself makes in the Republic, to distinguish between those who could possibly understand what he's talking about and all the rest of the fakers who can't, and basically degrade and tarnish the reputation of philosophy itself, because he recognizes that we're talking about a unique capacity of the human mind to identify the highest domain of principle. Never to completely understand that highest domain, that singular cause of all things, but to be in a constant state of hypothesis and advancing hypothesis in that regard. And that's not how Plato is introduced. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about how bad they teach Plato. There's no point in that. The point of the discussion tonight, from my perspective, is to provoke and encourage you and everyone else in the growing MAGM kind of movement. And that's not something limited just to the United States. We see this in Germany or in France or in Italy or nations in Asia or Africa or South America. There is a kind of a sense of, given the instability of the world, given the cultural insanity of this kind of liberal age, there is a craving for a sense of these higher principles. And reading Plato will not, in and of itself, as we can tell from all the universities and philosophy departments, will not provoke that burning desire to reestablish oneself, one's own identity, but also then out of a sense of love for your society, love of family, love of nation, love of humanity, to help establish a society according to that higher principle or domain of principle. As Plato references in this dialogue, the question of justice. But what that is of course, something that is not, it's not what people call social justice today, and it's certainly not merely a courtroom. It's that domain of principle. So my hope and encouragement is to provoke people to look and delve into this and to see it from a fresh perspective, to see it outside the academic boundaries. There was a famous dialogue between two people, one an American, Lyndon LaRouche, and another a European colleague of his. And there was a discussion amongst a number of people that were participating, but between largely these two people. And a concept had arisen, presented by the one from Europe, that the Renaissance of Italy was provoked and inspired by the introduction of Plato's dialogues. And it's true that for some period of time after the Christian era begins, up until around the 1400s, Plato's dialogues were not, there were a few, largely focused on the Timaeus, Phaedo, a couple of others, perhaps four at most, were still in kind of discussion. But the Republic, among many others, were lost. And they were brought back into Europe through various means, certainly from some of the Greek priests, Orthodox Greek priests. And it played a large role. I mean, and I'll touch more on that in a second, just to give context to how does this republic come into Western civilization because of that. But the premise was that the Renaissance, this rebirth of civilization, came from the introduction of Plato. And Mr. LaRouche's response was of the most provocative content to me, because it has stuck with me. And I've seen it emerge as a true and verifiable concept with what Trump's presidency, his election in 2016 provoked, but certainly even more so what we've seen since the 2020 election. That in verbatim terms, what Mr. LaRouche suggested is that no, a renaissance doesn't come, a rebirth, a reestablishment of civilization according to those highest of principles doesn't emerge because of some particular introduction. Of course, those have merit. If every school child was listening to Beethoven today, it would be wonderful. But of course, it would be better to sing Beethoven. But the point is that it was something that emerges as an absolute sense that survival of the human species, and that which gives meaning to survival, reemerges. And his way of putting that was as if out of the blue, that all of a sudden, what seems to be absent, which everyone seems to be frustrated by, is not occurring. Where is the leadership? Where is the activity? Where is the passion? Where is the concern publicly from the citizens of our country towards what's happening? And all of a sudden, it explodes. And there's this sense of political potential. There's a sense of a cultural reawakening. And in some sense, that's happening today. And the point of Plato is to educate that quality, to make it not simply a motive force, which it is intrinsically. Once people are gripped by this sense of concern for the survival of not themselves, but their grandchildren and their posterity, it's a question of, can we make that not merely intrinsically a force of action, but to make it conscious. As Percy Shelley said, to make it the role of the poet is to make this process conscious to a people. You have to ask, did St. Paul not do that in the Christian movement? Did Plato not do that? And these are, of course, references that Percy Shelley himself makes, and we've discussed that on these classes before. And so in some sense, we're looking to help educate and make more clear in the minds of a population, how do we rebuild? Because as Tony mentioned, Plato was living as an adult when this was written. We're talking Socrates' assassination or death by the state is 399 BC. And so Plato is writing sometime after that, prior to his death, which was around 347 BC. And he's reflecting upon a severe decline of his civilization, a 27-year war, 30-year war of the Peloponnesian War, a civil war, which he himself describes in the Republic as a civil war. A war like that of which Homer tells that went on for a generation or more, which was then the Trojan War, but which was a living part of Greek culture at the time. So Plato has lived through this, and he sees that and he sees the killing of Socrates, a man who represents the best of Athens, the best of Greek culture. And yet, so he sees a certain kind of collapse, a moral collapse, a cultural decay, an economic decay. What was in the potential of the rise of Athens and its higher conceptions from the leadership of people like Solon and others who had developed a higher Greek culture politically, philosophically, and scientifically. There was a great scientific kind of renaissance burgeoning around 500 BC, 100 years before Socrates' death. There's the great Greek tragedies, which happened after the great defeat of the Persian Empire in 480 by the Athenians to a large degree. And the question of Greek tragedy unfolds. Of course, already at that time, the playwrights like Aeschylus can see the collapse of the culture. And so Plato is, in some sense, recognizing, how do we reestablish the qualities of our civilization which allowed for such its ascendance? How do we avoid the dark age that Homer described? And in recognizing that there is a dark age upon us, that it's quickly, the qualities of a dark age, of further erosion and collapse of Greek culture into the kind of brutish aspects of imitation that we see in the Roman Empire, which adopt much of the Greek antiquity and its appearances, but nothing of the actual substance. A few maybe like Cicero do, but in general, it's lost to mere imitation until really the Renaissance, or as Tony said, with certain elements of the Christian movement. And in that sense, though, Plato is writing for all people who also recognize that their civilization is in a process of decay or total collapse and dark age. And he is at least helping to provide not a prescription in in some type of predicated list of rules or engineering program. But he recognizes that there are core questions at stake for any society, whether it's a city-state or if the Greek world, as Plato himself, I think, recognized, could have become what we identify as a nation. That the Peloponnesian War was ultimately a civil war. It was a fight within a nation. But that nation had never ultimately come into existence. And so it's of great value in that regard. Now, as Tony described in brief, what Plato inspires is really the movement of Alexander the Great to bring this Hellenic world, to bring the discovery and richness of what Plato has now revived in concept, and unfortunately perhaps limited to a certain class of people who took the time to really understand it. But from that level, they were able to, one, wage a war against the Persian Empire, kind of the globalist satanic force of the time, to push it back all the way to the Indus River, and to establish kind of a Greek cultural world throughout all of what is today Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and into Egypt. And there was kind of like the Hellenized world that ultimately becomes the Greek New Testament of the Christian movement and various aspects, which is a whole other subject. So Plato's ideas resonate throughout that period and into that kind of revival of civilization. When the Christian movement unfolds, it is at a point where that satanic globalist force that was then the Persian Empire during Alexander the Great's time, but centered in Babylon and parts of Phoenicia like Sidon and Tyre, the coastal kind of financial cities in the Eastern Mediterranean that Alexander the Great wages siege against, they reemerge with total power with the rise of the Roman Empire. And there's a near total destruction of civilization. And it really was that quality of thought and this quality of dialogue that was happening between even the Jewish community, that kind of uniquely monotheistic tradition, with the Greek culture. And you see it in the elements of even Plato's thinking. As much as there's a reference to the various pantheon of Greek gods, there's also a clear conception from Socrates and from Plato of a singular God, that which is the creation of all things. So, but as I mentioned, much of this work is then lost. By that time or soon thereafter, there was the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, set up by Greeks in Egypt. That's destroyed, I believe, in around 212 BC. Maybe Tony might have a more specific date. I think around the same time as Alexander. As Archimedes' death.
Yeah, I don't have a date.
So it's
approximate.
Yeah. So these works are lost to a large degree. Now they're revived. I just want to give people a sense of how this was introduced into our culture today. So there's just some historical context, because its revival itself helps to challenge what we often just take for granted. And I would say that a work of this quality has just been taken for granted for far too long and left to maybe a freshman course at a college, which now is even banned as old white men, as Jesse Jackson infamously said at Stanford. Plato's revival, as I mentioned, from some of the Greek priests that came over into Italy, but it was translated first into Latin by a gentleman by the name of Marsilio Ficino. And he did all of Plato's works that were then made available, which is, I think, what we have today in extent. And it was published in 1484. But he was working on it, and this is part of the Medici plan. The Medicis were funding this kind of revival of these concepts. Just as an interesting note, Ficino did also work. His main other work was Plato's theology on the immortal soul. And I'll come back to that in a second. So that's when it's first introduced into the kind of the Latinized Western world, is around the 1480s. So it was lost in between. It's made available in English by a guy named Henry Spence, a Scotsman, in 1763. That's the first English translation. The name of the dialogue in Greek is politeia, which is kind of constitution or art of politics. Maybe Tony has variations on it that he thinks Tony knows Greek well. But it's politeia. But it's given by Ficino the name of republic. And then that's continued. But it's made available in 1763 to the English world. Now, to what extent it was in the libraries of the colonies that Benjamin Franklin and others were developing, I have no clear proof of. But it's made available at that time, and the study of Greek antiquity by the founding fathers' generation is clearly expressed in things like the Federalist Papers. So this was an intrinsic part of the dialogue of the founding of our republic, without doubt. And 1763 is itself a significant year in that process. It's the end of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War. And it's at a time where the British imperial powers, with their satanic hellfires clubs and other elements that were just from anyone who was like Benjamin Franklin going to London in dialogue with the British on diplomatic exchanges, would have recognized, and Franklin soon well did, that they intended to crush their colonies. They've had enough of this independence. They're now the dominant naval power in the world. The French had lost that 7 Years' War. The British had been victorious, and they were out to then put the heel on the neck of the colonies. So the taxes, the tea taxes, the stamp taxes, the iron taxes quickly accelerate. They're out to punish and reduce the colonies to cheap labor holdings and resource extractions, not these independent free colonies that had existed earlier. So that was 1763. To me, that's just important because we're talking about reviving our nation and looking at the culture by which it was created in its first place. So that's really the history I wanted to cover, because I think without this, it's later publications, all of Plato's works were in English by 1804. And then, of course, you get the process that's unfolded since then. Now, before I touch on it, what I'd like to do is just it's awkward, because what I'd like to do is give some sense. It's such a great and long work, but I'm ultimately going to give some sense of what are the supposed what's the word I'm looking for? Controversial elements of Plato, and to give people a sense that what lurks within this compositionally, it's a dialogue. It's in dialogue form, but it's something you could sit down and read. There are many translations in which and they're all can be very different, but just read one and then maybe read another one if you read it again the second time. But I'd like to give some sense of the compositional nature of what Plato establishes in this work, because I think simply by distilling the composition, we can get a sense of what a gem this work is, how it survived nearly 2,500 years. And when you read it, it's as if you're reading something that applies to the crisis in your society today, unlike perhaps any other work written in the last 2,500 years. It certainly matches those few pieces, those qualities of work that really touch upon this aspect. But before I give that summary and deal with some of the controversial heresies, I would say, of Plato's Republic, one can't avoid an actual philosophical discussion. And why this is not academic fare is more than anything because if you avoid the question of the human soul, you cannot discuss Plato. Now, some people might we have a thing like soul music, or the soul of music. People's passion and emotion and intensity. It's not formal, it's not cold, it's not dry. But we're talking about your soul. What is your soul? Do you believe in a soul? Or do you acknowledge it? Do you know you have a soul? That's the premise of Plato's work. But it's not simply, does it exist or not? What is it? You know, if you were raised, I was raised Catholic, and you're given these stories of eternal damnation into the fires of hell, the kind of how you raise children with a moral conception. You might go to heaven, which is a sense of heavenly bliss, nice music, the child's version of when you die, you go to the good place or the bad place, fire, hell, damnation. Dante, of course, captures this in his work in the comedy, great divine comedy. But take away the religious or cultural elements or the education of children, which much of this is derived from. Is the soul eternal? Is your soul, by its very nature, indestructible? Does it live forever? If that is the intrinsic nature of the soul, then the question is, to what degree is it affected by the quality of life that you live? How does it continue to exist? In what state? Does how you live determine that quality of state of existence of your soul? Now this just subject alone, one, totally philosophical, and even could be considered abstract. But is not this question an expression of at least a concept that there is something, one, uniquely divine that relates within the human identity to that which is eternal? And are not these questions the questions that the artists and even scientists and political leaders must confront? Is this not what Donald Trump faces when he wonders, what is this all going to be for? Is it not to be remembered? Is it not for the concept of his soul, as it imparts itself to the future generations of Americans and people on this planet, to be remembered with grace and joy, rather than to be condemned as another failure, as a person who basically, when the times got tough, they went along. They took it easy. And as future generations look back and they look at the troubles they now confront, like young people today, are not young people looking, who among you have fought for us, have sacrificed to make something function, because this is a mess? What's happened? And at this point, you look at people and you can see that this is largely the motivation of the MAGA movement. That a lot of these grandparents are going, my God, I don't know what I've done. If I've not done what I should have up until this point, no point looking back. But you wonder, well, maybe I could have done some things differently, but minimally, I better do something today. But why? Merely for the sake that their life, even once they're gone, the efforts they make can be passed on. Is that quality, regardless if you identify that it's the soul is anything other than that sense of imparting something of strength, of inspiration, of joy, of courage, to future generations. So I raise that because if we don't discuss this, and if we don't discuss that poetic quality of the soul, that the subjective questions that have been turned into kind of, I don't know, drug therapy or bizarre hippie liberal, mush, but that the subjective question of improving one's own sense of identity over the course of one's life. Because what you're improving, what you're hoping to perfect is that which is going to live beyond your life. That which you are, as a part of the universe, eternally have a unique opportunity to shape when you're alive. So these are some of my impressions. And they're partly the impressions of reading Plato. But if you haven't asked these questions, if you haven't pondered the soul beyond merely a religious question, you will be very struck by the role of Plato and Socrates' philosophical work, because this is why it's so outside the academic realm, and why it really is a profound basis to help ennoble and to give shape to the new temple we're building to human creativity, the temple of our union that was once built by our founding fathers, built again by Lincoln, and has to be rebuilt again today. So as Plato starts the Republic, you'll find many people may remember this if you've read it once before or you had some experience with it. He deals with a particular individual by the name. There's a few of them together. So I should give some context. Plato always sets up his dialogues almost like theater. They're coming back from the port of Piraeus in Athens. They're walking back and they're going to gather at someone's house. I think an older gentleman's house. Socrates knows well and says, "Come to my house." And he's around for a bit and then he leaves. He's not the most serious maybe person, but there's a person. So there's two of the people are Plato's brothers, Adeimantus and Glaucon. And I'm not going to really touch on a lot of the specifics of the back and forth because I would get lost and you would get bored. But at least you should know who's participating. They're actually Plato's brothers, literally his brothers, Adeimantus and Glaucon. And they come from a leading political family in Athens. There's Socrates, and there's also this sociopath who's also, I think, a sophist of the time, which is a kind of a fake philosopher, a typical professor academic type like today, named Thrasymachus. So it starts with really Thrasymachus, and he's a bit rabid. He's kind of foaming at the mouth fairly quickly. They kind of poke fun at him. But they deal with his proposal that really justice is the rule of the stronger that might essentially makes right. That who is in power establishes what justice is, and doing what they say is what is just or unjust. But ultimately, the people in power should be as unjust as possible, to abuse power as much as possible. Sound familiar? So they should be as unjust as they possibly can, but to have power, but yet what they say is ultimately what justice is. So of course it makes no sense, and what you find from most politicians and people in society who have taken advantage of this kind of liberal world where there are no principles. It's just make it up as you go. And that's basically what Thrasymachus does. So they dispel with him fairly quickly. And then what does Socrates introduce? Somewhat to the shock of his audience. But he says, really, we're talking about the soul. I mean, what we're talking about justice, because the question is, what is justice? they're discussing what is the soul. The justice is something related to justice itself is an eternal idea. It's a concept. It's an idea that itself is not temporal. Doesn't come into existence and then die. It's a concept that is eternal. And in some sense, what we're looking at is a question that has to be taken into account. And of course, the immediate irony, this is just book one. There are 10 books in the Republic. Book one, it points the fact that Thrasymachus doesn't really understand the principle of the soul. He will be condemned for eternity, and he practically is, but with a certain soft touch that, he's made, his condemnation is dependent upon participating with Socrates in a practically eternal dialogue. But that the rejection of the concept of the soul, which is made even more famous and even more eloquently in the argument of the Phaedo, which is the death of Socrates, his final argument, as Plato portrays it, where he argues in even greater layers and character that why the soul is immortal, why there's no reason to fear death, which comes up in the Republic. But this takes place in the time sequence of Socrates' life earlier than the Phaedo. Okay, so that's really the premise of this, that what we're looking at in some ways, if we're looking at justice in society and what is justice, then in some sense we cannot disregard that we're talking about a concept that is only made available to a species, the human species, that is capable of contemplating and acting upon that which is also eternal, that there is something eternal within us. And this comes back, and you'll see how it manifests even within the concepts of different political systems. Now, there are a couple of things that are very kind of passé, controversial. All the cynics kind of like to pull on these aspects to kind of make fun of Plato or Socrates, or kind of poke holes in their idealism or their strength and principle. One of which is, a lot of people focus on the political systems, the philosopher king, a system of honor called democracy, then it devolves into oligarchy, and then it devolves to democracy, and then tyranny. These take place, that series takes place in book 8 and 9. And there's a lot of focus on that from the standpoint of political theory, political philosophy. But what's oftentimes missed is that it's not simply abstracted as political systems, but that it looks at the character of citizenry that is largely accountable for why their society continues to devolve, that it ultimately comes back to the quality of individual leadership. And in some sense, the understanding of the nature of the human soul. But yet, nonetheless, his political insights into how states evolve has a lot of value. But the other thing that becomes, the other two things which are very controversial, one comes up in book 2, which is the censorship that he calls, actually, and I'll address this in a second, for all the censorship of various pieces of work, tragedy, poetry, Homer, the epic myths and stories. There's a lot of myths, Greek myths, as we know, some of which captured by Homer, by Hesiod, by the Greek tragedians, the playwrights. But I was, and reading this again, I was just completely struck. Part of what is given the circumstances of our society today. I'll make that clear in a second. But the other controversial one was, and I'll come back to this one later too, is the raising of children. He calls for a communal raising of children, even kind of without marriage, at least within the leadership class, what he calls the guardians, or is translated as the guardians. But the leadership, the people that are responsible to lead the society, that come from all different parts of society, ideally. But then once they're in that leadership position, they should raise the children, not have marriages. And the whole thing to me seems, well, you'll see what I think about it. That's actually, I think, book 5. But those are just some of the controversies. And so if you've heard about Plato or you hear disparaging comments, especially if you're part of, if you attend a church and but some of the commentary or people that you might talk to kind of look down on Plato because he seems to be kind of Greek culturally, that's immoral. And there was a big fight in the Renaissance whether people prior to Christ could really identify these higher conceptions of principle. And some of those things still creep in. But when you look at the work and how he deals with things, it's just so different. So let me show you what I mean. So in the second book, he takes up the educating of children and the leader, and specifically the education of a leadership class, the guardians, which can come from all walks of society, given their quality of disposition. That profound child from whatever background that shows a quality of reflection and courage and steadfastness and so on. And he says, but we shouldn't necessarily have them read Homer and the tragedians and the Greek myths. We should ban these things. We should basically limit it only to certain material. But what's the principle that Plato references? Is that if we want young people to emulate that which we consider to be that which is most perfect and divine, powerful in the universe itself, if we want our children to emulate their conception of God, or our conception, our civilization's conception of God in the most perfect being, we should we limit or restrict how we present. We should either make it clear that these are not gods, or we should not let them be used for the instruction of young people. And so there's two elements that are provocative there. One, when you think of the question of what kind of material should children be allowed to read, how many on this call and how many in our nation today would easily accept that we should just let whatever children want to read be read? Well, we know that that's not the question. We have people making decisions, putting, pornography in front of children's eyes, or worse. So there's a certain sense of, you do literally want to make sure and instruct children with a certain strictness of concept. But even more importantly, if this is a question of how do we establish justice, or how do we establish beyond just the word itself, how do we rebuild our society or civilization to once again grow in the ascendance, to once again grow to becoming flourishing, as Athens was a century earlier, and as the Greek world was a century earlier when it defeated the Persians in heroic fashion. Similar to us, how we rebuild our society. So it's again the manufacturing powerhouse of the world, an industrial and scientific miracle. That the concept of God and a clarity of that becomes a cornerstone, a key pillar of that temple. So you can see, first book, that what we're discussing here is related only if we're willing to identify that the premise is this unique ability of the human individual or human society to identify those things which are eternal because of the existence of the human soul. The second book sets up a question in dialogue, back and forth in a dialectical method, but really to underline is, what is our conception of that highest and most beautiful and profound principle? And he develops this more. These are basic, just first approximations, but yet are these not the things that are resonating today in the hearts and minds of many Americans? Now, in the book 3, it's a continued discussion of the guardians and their capability that they're going to have to lead us into battle, lead us into wars. They're going to have to deal with the most difficult circumstances. What is the quality we will need within our leaders to be able to lead us? in this society. And what Socrates, again, helps to shape the discussion around is, again, that nature of that human soul in a specific way, that we have to provide an understanding of our leadership, of our young people who are going to become leadership, to overcome the fear of death. Not to celebrate their youth, not to revel in the kind of physical bliss of young adulthood, but to overcome the fear of death. Now, what's the basis of overcoming? Why should one not be afraid of death? Well, as we know from reading Plato's Phaedo dialogue, as I mentioned earlier, as implicit even in the discussion, is because the soul is immortal. We are not physically immortal. We are going to die, but yet there is something of our existence which will continue ever after. And so by book 3, we're already operating from the standpoint that to build a functioning society, to rebuild a flourishing civilization, the questions of the immortality of the soul become part of this. There's also a great discussion of art and music. I mean, it's a similar kind of characteristic, that the soul, once you have that, let our artists be those who are gifted. He identifies musical training is a more potent instrument than any other in the education of our young people. And we nourish the love of beauty. But can these questions of true art and beauty, of music, and a love of beauty be nourished in those who don't identify that which is in them that is eternal? So this is how the Plato's Republic begins. Now, the fourth book, I believe, was probably hugely influential on the shaping of our US Constitution and even the Declaration of Independence. As is said in this translation, which was unfortunately by this gentleman Jowett, who's very popular in the translations or publication of things, but that Socrates says the goal of the whole will be where we find justice. And what he develops in book 4 is that if we're going to have a just society, then it can't simply be a happiness or what's good for a certain set of people, but it's got to be a set of happiness and a good for all of the people, all classes. So if it's the workers, the farmers, the soldiers, the leadership class, that you have to recognize. And so in some sense, what you find are these questions that shape that principle that shapes our founding documents, the pursuit of happiness. But again, look at our Declaration of Independence. That all men are created equal. On what premise? What's the underlying premise that all men are created equal? Is there any fundamental aspect where men are created equal physically? Are there any physical attributes in any two men anywhere in the world that are identical, exactly the same in the smallest minutia? There's nothing. And yet all men are created equal? Is the underlying premise not the immortal soul? And yet that question is not necessarily the immortality of the soul developed in such a profound extent is not found, not in this way, in the New Testament. It's an underlying premise. It's certainly the cultural outlook that they're operating from, but its clarity, its scientific and philosophical quality of demonstration is made in these documents, as is in our preamble of our Constitution, that we look to defend the general welfare and posterity. And again, this is something that is established in Book 4. Now, in Book 5, he gets into the raising of the family, which is really, it's hard not to have a reflex. But one thing that context people have to have, and so I said for the leadership class, but here, he's referencing no marriages, nobody knows whose kids are whose. That would be fun. We wouldn't know whose kids are whose, so we'd have to assume that every kid could be yours. So every kid could be yours. You should treat them like your son or daughter, because maybe they are. I mean, it's just all kind of wild. You might ascribe it to he's just Greek or something. But the problem is that this wasn't Athenian culture. This was not how Plato was raised. But it's much more like how Spartan children were raised. In Sparta, it was a much more militaristic culture. So you'll see how Plato ends this book by perhaps what he really thinks about this whole thing. But there are a couple of things that are worth pointing to. Why does Plato reference this? Well, the two things. One, he puts women, obviously given the fact that they have physical deficiencies to men, but he puts them on equal footing in terms of their responsibility. The best wives, the best marriages will be between those two people who have both developed an understanding of the requirements that are necessary for their society, their civilization to function. That a man will be benefited to have a wife, and a husband that understand those questions together. That to me seems quite, as much as, it's a provocative conception, and it really puts on a sense of responsibility it's just a little bit surprising. I think everyone sees why. The other purpose he puts to this, raising the families and children this way, this kind of very Spartan, purely Spartan way, really. But he references a necessity for unity. And in some sense, it is this, you can see it in this section, where Plato's heart is torn by what's happened to Greek civilization. That whatever unity they might have had in fighting the Persians, which was the second time greatly defeated, they were victorious in 480 against the Persians. So it's like 100 years prior now, when Plato might be writing this. But he wants unity. He wants a sense of, and he recognizes that the most destructive elements of a culture will be discord, will be tribalism, factions. And so he's hypothesizing, even if it's extreme and a little bit bizarre, because we all know, and Plato then, and they knew then the role of the family. But that almost anything should be done to create a sense of unity within the society. Now, of course, the unity Plato is imagining is critical, and Socrates is what I've just referenced in the first 4 books. Those pillars. And I'll cover that again, but maybe in questions. I don't want to repeat myself too much, and I probably want to get moving here. So he ends book 5 with someone, Glaucon or Adeimantus, asking him some questions like, "Are you sure about this? This sounds a little weird." And he says, and Socrates basically says, I don't know. Maybe what we need to look more at the philosophical questions. That what we're really looking at is perhaps a difference of we're getting too caught in kind of an social engineering mode. Let's look at the deeper philosophical questions, to put it in kind of colloquial language. And he ends up referencing, let's be clear, we are really talking here about 2 different domains of sense perception versus the domain of principle. domains of opinion versus the domain of knowledge. Lovers of opinion versus the lovers of wisdom, knowledge, and truth. That's really what we're talking about. That there are really two different characteristics to the human soul. And we want to look at, we want to put emphasis on this higher aspect, this higher quality of the soul, which is capable of attaining to something like true knowledge of the real nature of the universe. So this ends really the first aspect of the book, of the work, with book 5. And at book 6, you get a huge shift into what can be nothing less than perhaps one of the most profound contributions to the process of scientific discovery ever written in human history. And it is something that Lyndon LaRouche referenced over and over again in his writings. And you see it reflected in various works of scientific discovery. So it's difficult. Book 6 and book 7. Book 6 could be the book that develops this scientific process and conception that Plato references as the good. He said the good is the author of knowledge to all things known, but it is also the author of their being and essence. Yet the good, and this is not his conception of God, it's almost the means by which God acts, yet the good is not essence, but far exceeds essence in dignity and power. So that's a quote from Socrates in this translation. And I think it's Glaucon that says, by the light of heaven, how amazing. And it really is. I mean, it's just, you can tell the way Plato develops it, it's not cute like I might have just described, it might have said it. It was just like, that's stunning. That is so profound what you just said. And he basically says, can you say more? Say more. Say a lot more. And he develops at the end of book 5 or end of book 6 these 4 kind of characteristics of the soul. Reason at the highest, understanding lower, faith, and then perception. And in the process, he develops an understanding that the realm of opinion and the realm of knowledge come at a characteristic of a method of science itself, what we would call science today, or a method of hypothesis, a method of knowing. And Plato knows it's such a refined conception that he has even his brothers in the dialogue admit they don't really know what Socrates is talking about. So he has to clarify and say it again. The best I can explain it without trying to get into too much language regarding it is to recognize a major aspect of what we consider Western science today. Isaac Newton is known for understanding that the planetary orbits operate according to the inverse square law of their masses with some gravitational constant. And he was able to discern this from the planetary orbits. Now, when you asked him what caused it, he said, I have no idea. And he says, I have a problem. I have a problem with this, what they called the spooky action at a distance. What's causing one planet and another to attract because of their mass? I don't know. It just comes off, if you look at all the data and all the planetary motions, you get this equation. Well, Plato, in this dialogue in book 6, identifies that method, similar to a geometric proof, that underlying it, there are basic assumptions. But if you take a step back from that sense of science, you have to wonder, how did Isaac Newton know what the planetary orbits were? He didn't develop the orbits. I mean, he knew what they were, but he didn't discover them. He didn't make the orbits knowable. He didn't make the data of the orbits. He didn't provide that. It was somebody completely different. It was Kepler, a German scientist, Kepler. And Kepler's approach is what Plato describes in Book 6. And it's very simply put, Kepler said, why are there 6 planets? And why are they arranged the way that they are? Why? Why did God, and this is very clear, Kepler's very clear of his attribution even to Plato and to Socrates. Why are the planets spaced out the way they are? He comes with a basic approximation and says, okay, well, why are the orbits, what are the orbits actually? And he finds that they're ellipses. Okay. He finds out that each orbit is a different ellipse. Okay. So Kepler's question is, why is each ellipse different? And when he comes to realize that, and he writes a whole book about it, praising Plato as much as one could imagine. And he comes up with the most remarkable, profound discovery of not only what the planetary system is, but why it is the way it is. And in that is the information that Newton and the people perhaps behind Newton were pulling together. But exactly as Plato describes in Book 6, the first method takes you to a very materialistic world of kind of basic assumptions that give you some kind of coherence, give you some, as he says, a kind of understanding, but don't apply to the higher principle of reason and to the nature of the universe as a whole. Kepler's approach just takes you higher and higher and higher. You never come down to a kind of silly materialism that no one can really explain. But it works. You know how you can act upon it. You kind of know how it works, like an engine. But Kepler's approach takes you to those higher and higher principles of the nature of the divine. Plato lays that out, 2,000 years before Kepler's discovery. So I'm going to move now somewhat quickly, but Book 7 is the famous allegory of the cave. So he's demonstrated this higher question of the soul, this question of reason, of higher and higher discoveries about the universe itself that gives us true insight into the universe and how it's functioning, and how we would build a functioning society, versus this realm of opinion where you have some understanding, but you might say it's practical. And in essence, Plato is saying it is insufficient to build a functioning civilization. It's basically for the fakers, for the nimwits, the dimwits, and the midwits. So he makes that clear in his allegory of the cave. And it's been described so many times. I'm sure many of you are familiar if you're not, but it's an extraordinary kind of metaphor for what he's developed in Book 6. Books 8 and 9 then deal with what I mentioned earlier, the political systems. The question of a philosopher king is perhaps the most ideal. An enlightened philosopher that understands these higher principles, has this quality of courage and action, but operates within that higher domain of the immortal soul. And that devolves. But Plato is so insightful as how it devolves. And when you read it, and I'm sure many of you will see how you can see the course of our nation over the last 100 years. As Tony mentioned, the collapse of our nation happened sometime early in the 20th century, where the downward turn is very evident. The founding of the Federal Reserve, the World War I, the massive debt creation, the kind of liberalism that is introduced. Even I had a friend the other day who said he showed how vegetable oil was introduced into the American diet, and when obesity starts to take off is exactly at the same time in the early 1910s. You'll see that if you take the course of our culture from that point to today, you'll see a kind of devolution, much like what Plato describes. But again, it's not just theoretical structures of a system. He's talking about characters of the individual continue to devolve. And the premise, of course, is that the resurgence of a viable civilization comes from the ennoblement of some individuals who take it upon themselves to elevate to the highest possible conception of the ideal, of the creator. And of course, as Tony said, this certainly would have inspired the Christian movement and did. So in book 10, the final book, and I was again struck by this irony. And there's a long section of kind of a myth that Socrates retells that can be a little bit kind of, perhaps it made more relevance at the time. But the main thing that was striking to me in book 10, that's near the very end of the book, what most striking was he comes back to the censorship question and poetry and the arts and the education of the population as a whole. He says, who will profit if under the influence of honor, which is one characteristic of a society where honor is privileged, but for the sake of honor. He says, who will profit if under the influence of honor, money or power, or even the excitement from poetry, if he neglects justice and virtue? And he develops a sense that it's not the censorship of poetry that we discussed before in book 2 on the question of the higher conception of God. There's also a different question, even in the composition and approach to poetry. Because if the poetry is written, if the artists, let's say more broadly speaking, if poetry is broadly the artistic realm, that the artists strive to ennoble the immortal soul within the people of their culture? Or do they look to titillate them, give them a state of pleasure or excitement, to move their emotions and passions, to pull their heartstrings, as much of the Hollywood culture does today? Then he makes this distinction in the very intent of the artists, that it's not simply to talk or to define the higher conceptions of God, except maybe if you're, when you're thinking of children, perhaps that's apropos. But when we think of culture more broadly, it is to enrich this quality in each of us that makes our relationship to that which is eternal, to that creator, enriched, and perhaps most importantly, more self-aware, more conscious to each of us. And in essence, what motivated him to write the Republic. So that's what I have. And interested if there's comments, thoughts, or feedback. And hopefully you'll all take time tomorrow or as soon as you get time to open up the Republic and begin to read it and share your thoughts and gain as much joy as I did from it.
Terrific.